Professor, one of the things that you really wanted to make a point of with our youth ministers today was they needed to resist the temptation to look at their calendar and say, which is the one day I'm going to talk about sexual education, ethics, and behaviors this year? Because it's not a one-time talk. Why not, and how in a finite world with a finite number of dates should a youth minister approach this?
Well, there are lots of youth ministry programs that will talk about sexuality or sexual ethics issues, dating issues, sexual behavior, and they will just do one weekend retreat or a one-night lesson and check it off and say, I'm done. And I think culturally that's because we've bought into this notion of the big talk. Once we do it, we're done, we're good. Maybe 4 years later you could do it again because they've all graduated. But actually we're talking about sexuality all the time during youth group. So it's a myth that we're not doing more than one education lesson. But it's also really preventing us from thinking intentionally about how we could talk about sexuality better. So some curriculum might ask us to do this for 12 weeks or 15 weeks. I also think that's burdensome because there's all kinds of other issues you want to address when you're doing youth ministry. So what I try to encourage folks to do is think about the ways in which that big definition of sexuality, if we're thinking about intimacy or sensuality or gender or health, behaviors, if we think about ways to address each of those throughout the year, then we're doing a much better job and we're actually modeling for our youth that we think about this a lot. And sexuality education is part of how we act all the time. It might be what kind of rules you set up for when you go on the retreat about behavior you expect from people. That's a sexuality education lesson, especially if you're saying no one gets to sneak off at night or certain people aren't allowed to engage in behaviors or join rooms. Those are explicit messages, but you might also just talk about the way that we respect one another's bodies. That it's not okay to run into the youth group room and jump on top of everyone without permission from people. Maybe one, somebody gets hurt, and two, maybe people just don't like being touched like that. You might think about the culture you've created in your youth group. Does everybody feel like they have to hug one another? Do some people not like that? You could use those as teachable moments about the ways in which we interact with one another, how we set up our boundaries, how we engage in behaviors. But we might also look to Scripture. I know that for the most part, every youth group I've ever been a part of, people have avoided reading the Song of Songs, right? It's love, poetry, it's kind of gushy, it's a little explicit in spots. Every year on Valentine's Day in my youth ministry program, the kids loved it. They would look forward to this day. They would pick different parts. They would just have to open it and pick a part, no looking at it, and read parts of it. And I would have them read it with their cheesiest, media-informed voice, whatever they wanted to do. But it got them over the notion that this wasn't something we talked about, that it wasn't okay to use language like this. I mean, if we look at the mystics, they basically wrote love letters to God. That's how they connected with God. It's okay to think about our sexuality and intimacy as part of our relationship with God. And this was a corny, fun way to get them to see that that's been part of our religious tradition for years. So it's not as though it has to always just be the one lesson or they invite one person to come talk about it, but that really just recognize the ways you're already talking about it and create some fun and interesting additional ways to be explicit about the sexuality education we're providing in youth ministry.